Welcome to the IT OT Insider. David, who did you bring this time?
Well, I wanted to do something totally different here. We're going to discuss a super interesting topic. It's a topic which we have been discussing for quite a while. We've been touching it, and it's the thing called open source in the industry. And I'm very happy to have Alexander Krüger here with us. He's the CEO and co-founder of United Manufacturing Hub. He knows everything there is to know about open source, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I assume, Alexander.
Yeah, hopefully the good. Yeah.
Hopefully the good. Yeah, no. Let's start with that. Okay, good. Hey, welcome to the podcast. Can you just introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I'm actually mechanical engineer by background. So if you think about asking somebody about open source, I might be from the surface the wrong person to do that, but then quite fast actually transition into system integration. So studying mechanical engineering, then moved to system integration. So shipping applications for 2.5 years, creating business value, if you would ask consultants. But then we understood that there's a missing software building piece, or something in between application and the data sources, which there's a lot of noise currently about that. And we chose like the path of being open source to crack that nut. And yeah, I'm co-founder and CEO. So happy to share my 2 cents on the topic. Yeah.
Willem, it might be the start of a joke. So you have a mechanical engineer, a mathematical engineer, and a chemical engineer.
It sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, David. It's like a boring joke.
Yeah, okay.
Too nerdy. No, so Alexander, I think what sets you apart from many others is especially like this open source part. So can you go a bit deeper? I mean, usually our audience is what, let's say our audience is technical enough. So I would like to know like what's behind it and why did you choose open source compared to like writing something out using libraries?
Yeah. So like when back then we were like system integrators, we've always been technical people. Therefore we like been, okay, we are now in a factory, we have this nice dashboard and we need something to pump it into and like data into. And then the obvious choice was first you thought about, okay, let's get to traditional vendors, let's get a quote, let's have a trial license, and you were 3 weeks down the road. And it was so frustrating how the software is distributed and trialed in manufacturing. So it was quite obvious for us to do it the way that we like to explore software. So trying it, getting it on the hands and proving the value firsthand. So, and this is also, if you think infrastructure, actually the normal thing to do. If you think operating systems, you can think database. If you think streaming platforms, the leading ones are open source. So we thought, okay, open source or like a data handling in manufacturing will be a core infrastructure. Therefore, open source is just logical. And over the time, we already thought it was something, but also building a better product is also a function of users and usage and getting feedback. And specifically, if you're like in a dusted thing like industrial software, it's hard to get a first customer. So it's obviously easier to get somebody on the internet, trial your software and give you like unstructured feedback. And this is actually also a flywheel for us. This problem is not solved, I would say. It's like just getting data from A to B in manufacturing is everybody's pitching UNS and it's there, it's done, but it's not solved in our opinion yet. And therefore exposing us to people makes it good. Therefore open source is a way to do that. Yeah.
It's like your whole platform an open source project. Is that the way I need to imagine it? Or are you like using open source components?
No. Our platform, there are 2 pieces to it. So it's the data infrastructure, which runs in the sites of our customers, 100% open source, Apache 2.0 license. So we can not do anything about them. So if you use them, it shovels data from A to B. We can never pull the rug if you want it like that. Then there's an additional component or management console, which makes it easier to work with it. And this is proprietary. So like a SaaS application, also harder to put open source as it's more distributed application. And this is also a monetization model. It's called Open Core. So giving the core of the platform for free and then have certain features for enterprises, multi-users, role-based access behind the paywall. And this is then a good approach to monetize also open source.
And I'm gonna play a bit good cop, bad cop here, if you don't mind. If I take my, let's say my typical OT hats on, I put it on, and where open source components are something which we all know from hobby projects
Yeah,
or the IT world or
yeah,
I'm
but
pretty sure most of IT is running on open source.
it is.
Not just hobby, it's everything basically.
But the
yeah.
people still thinking like that, yeah. So fair point, yeah.
But I'm I don't know. I'm John, your OT manager,
Mm.
and I go like, yeah, but I feel more comfortable paying I don't know whatever amount of money for the solution offered
Yeah.
by this vendor because then I'm sure. I don't
Mm.
know. I'm sure that this thing is going to run in my factory for 20 years, for
Mm.
example. Is that? But you say that's the old way of thinking.
Yeah. So this is the Red Hat SUSE way of monetizing open source. So if you take trying to be now a history teacher, I don't know if correct me if I'm
No, but
not
you
doing it.
you teach us history.
Yeah,
That's
okay,
very
okay. Let
interesting.
me try my best and don't look stupid in the meantime. But so like there was this wave of first generation open source, which was mostly focused around operating systems. So you had like Linus Torvalds, obviously making a huge leaps with Linux. And then you need to install like a lot of stuff on top of that. So it was not something like plug and play like it would be now. And then enterprises like struggle to run that commercially. So like with certain availability guarantees, etc. So then was a smart company, Red Hat, like combining Linux with a lot of those application nitty gritty pieces on top and bundling it with a CD. So here you go, you have a product. So it's open source, but we sell it to you. It was quite an interesting value proposition because now I have somebody to call if something goes wrong. This was the first way of getting software. But then you are in a conflict of making software as good as possible. But at some point, people then think, okay, do I really need the support? Because it runs now for 5 to 10 years and I've never had any issue. And then you're like in a
Yeah.
complete conflict. Then this second wave of open source was this paying for compute or storage way of thinking. Like you had databases, you have streaming platforms. So MongoDB, for example, would be, or Elasticsearch would be a good example. But so it's hard of an application, it's hard to scale. Therefore, they take that burden off of you and just pay per gigabyte or whatever. But then those hyperscalers came into play, AWS and Azure, and pulled the rug and said, you can also just use host the open source project on our platform and make it way cheaper. And then these open source vendors like, something goes wrong here with our monetization model. And then they brought into place so-called like AGPL licenses. So licenses they just forbid those hyperscalers to host open source as a service. So a little bit technical, but this was also like a little bit destined to fail in my opinion, because you now have like this conflict already in the making. And so now it's a time for this open core part of doing that. So like currently now there's still like a lot of projects pulling the rug or do a clawback. So for example, a good recent example is Nuts. So everybody's like the discussion of do I use MQTT, do I use Kafka, do I use Nuts as the broker? And then they took the so they is an open source project. You can give your project to a foundation, so they take care of maintaining and the brand, etc. And they had obviously some monetization issues, I guess, and therefore they did a clawback and said this is now again our brand and our source code, and like in a huge public battle now with
Oh,
CNCF, which is just ugly, and
could they
therefore
do
you
that?
yeah they can, or they're trying to do that. I'm not into the trenches on the details where they're currently standing, but I think this is now an ongoing legal battle which is still in the making, because there you need to have like before you old way of open source is technical person doing something great and then be not on accident but be successful with it, and then like Docker, and then trying to or be never successful in monetizing that. And now you need to make sure that already when you start you already had in mind how do I monetize that. And this is open core, like having some enterprise features like with the UMH, you as a technical user forever free to use, like in this one man army in a company use it. But as soon as you need these enterprise features, like invite David wants to invite Willem to the UMH, then it's an enterprise feature, and this is the third way I would say.
So that actually means that not all open source software is created equally. There are big differences in what to and what would be from an enterprise perspective. What would be the well basically the green or the red flags? What are the things to look out for when you're using open source components?
So like the lawyer answer is always check on the licensings, because open source is also stacked. So you have like open source companies building on top of other open source project, and then it goes like it's like can be a card box. So if you buy open source, make sure that you like comply with the licenses. Apache or MIT are the super permissive ones where you can just do what you want. But sure that you don't get into any BSL, but perhaps too deep for the technical piece, but sure to check on the licenses. And secondly, this is also still true, this tinkering situation. So you have this open source projects which are not in any way commercially maintained. So there's just, it's parked somewhere, pepped onto into CNCF or somebody else, but nobody has actually interest or commercial interest to evolve that platform. So it's like a slow dev. And you don't want to be part of any of those projects who are not on a track actually of commercialization, because they can also just die slowly but steadily. Yeah.
Yeah, that's that. I've seen it myself as well. Now I'm putting my IT hat on, where you're developing a piece of software, and yeah, you're selecting a couple of libraries, and then yeah, after a couple of years, you want to upgrade, and you come to the conclusion that there is no support anymore
Yeah.
for this library.
And it's
Or
still,
nobody's working with it.
yeah, this is also described by the buzz factor. How many buzz it needs to kill the whole development team of the platform. It's only one person like doing it as a side hustle. So a good example is Bentos. We're also using that. It's like a software component who moves data from A to B. It was just maintained by one person at the core, so quite risky to set up on top of that. Now they're bought by Red Panda. But this is also something, are you sure that enough people are interested and pushing it forward so that not one person getting uninterested or something really bad happens can kill the whole project? Yeah.
I wanna make the bridge a bit from the pure open source
Yeah.
discussion to more the the data
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah.
Let's hold back on UNS for a while,
Yeah.
maybe for a while, maybe as a cliffhanger or so. But one of the things I'm seeing in general, and we've been discussing that in previous podcasts as well, is if you talk about building a modern data stack today, it's not so easy. There are no, at least from my perspective, not really complete solutions. If you really take the OT functionality and the IT functionality together,
Yeah.
what you typically end up with is either you still stay a bit more on the OT side, so you're selecting vendors which come more from an OT background. In some cases, if more, for example, if your project is more IoT heavy or something like that, you typically lean in towards the IT side. You're more into the IT solution stack. I want to talk a bit more on what you see happening in the world from your perspective on how IT and OT are, from a technological point of view, maybe converging or
Yeah.
not.
Would like to build a bridge also about convergence. Like it's always like this thing that you now see at trade fairs, IT, OT converges, but it's still true. So you have, like I said, this, I would say, hardware centric way of building software, or from the hardware vendors at least. So the Siemens, the Rockwells, or the historians less SCADA attached software players who are still on this gray software, if you want, so gray rectangular boxes way of thinking. And then you have the IT way, which is then Snowflake, Databricks, Azure, but not OT persons can use IT, and rather the OT burst softwares fail to scale, like in the classical IT sense. And I think this is quite important to strike a balanced approach here. This is also why we open source. You need to know your users. They know Ignition, for example. They know OSIS of Pi. They know how Tier Portal works. This is what they work, but they need under the hood something scalable like a Kafka and a Kubernetes cluster perhaps to load balance and have a high availability setup. But the skill set is different. So we need to have it be visually targeted and also from the functional perspective for OT, but under the hood, it needs to be the next generation or the cloud native way of building software. And yeah, so this is also some insights we hopefully got from the open source community, because we're exposed to the people that are the users. Yeah.
You're you're putting the core, let's say, out there as an open source code base. Do you expect others also to continue developing that, or to help in the development? And who would those others be?
Yeah.
Because let's say I don't expect that people in the plants are going to say, I'm going to go in the code base and
No.
fix a bug, for example.
But it's in any case also a little bit of a misconception about open source, that you put software out there and then the community will maintain it. So even if, like in mature projects, for example, like Grafana, 80% to 90% of the code or the pull
It's done.
requests, the code is built by the company. And then
Yeah.
you have like also in our case, people have functional problems, see features that are not there, or something that we don't see, and they provide that as templates in the open core. So, for example, now we have Backhoff as a new protocol that needs to be in there. Somebody has a problem and he forks that in. So something that we didn't see, but this is like smaller than 10% of the code that's coming in, but still quite useful. And we need to tune it in anyway. But yeah, this is what we see.
It's interesting, anyways, because yeah, who would that then be? Those contributors, those are people who really need to have a very deep IT understanding, I assume, because you can't just contribute to a
Or
platform that
just
is.
raise an issue and say,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah. So therefore, we also provide the GitHub, the Discord. So it's not only GitHub
Ah.
where people. So in the IT world, you just live on GitHub and live in pull requests and issues. But this is also not the known forum for automation engineers. So we have also a Discord, which is an everybody can join community. Currently, 1,000 people are in there roughly. And then they have also a more unstructured approach to talk about what doesn't work with UMH and where they see limitations. And then we can also derive the right measures from that. And I think this is also something which open source has a huge edge over to create a caring community. So normally you would have perhaps a vendor community, and if you're super large, you can then start having your vendor specific meetups, etc., pp. But this is then quite late, super late in the stage of a company. I'm talking now IPO scale companies, and which then can do that. But with open source, you from day one have a huge focus of connecting people and problems via forums like Discord. And then they can talk with like-minded people about the limitations and the use cases and what problems they solve. And this is also super, super strong and important for us.
So yeah, I'm an OT manager, or I'm an IT OT integration person, or something like that. Um, how should I organize myself to make, I would say, the use of open source components sustainable in my company? Yeah? Would you go for an SLA? How do you need to make sure that it's
Yeah.
not just my one colleague who
Yeah.
is a bit more IT savvy but leaves the company or
Yeah.
gets sick or whatever? So how do I organize myself? Or is it maybe exactly the same as with any other software component?
Yeah. So what is normally failing in your company if you buy software? Is it really the software, or is it the bits and pieces in between certain software components that are actually failing? Jordan, who left the company 3 months ago, stitched together in an all-nighter. In my opinion, or like in our experience, these are the stuff that's actually failing. And this is then the same as if you now build a proprietary stack with a system integrator that left the company. You are as vulnerable with proprietary company as software as you are with open source software. So perhaps there are bugs to open source software, which you then don't have like any legal construct to force the vendor to solve them. But in my opinion, as long as it's an active and large project, you as in a good position as you are with proprietary software, if not in a better one, because in my opinion, open source software is well better tested as long as they're distributed well than any proprietary software could be. So as you assume, MQTT broker is open source, in a Postgres database, which is open source, it's way more better tested than any historian or OPC server that you get from a proprietary vendor.
I think you see, again, you're seeing much more open source core components being rolled out. But it's usually not mentioned as
Open source,
a
yeah.
feature, let's say. It's like, okay, it just happens to run in containers. So yeah, you're going to use Docker. I don't think you need Kubernetes in the plant. Um, why are you putting this open source part to the front even?
Because it's honest, I would say. So because like if you go to a proprietary vendor, I don't want to point any competitor like from us, but they're also using open source software. Then perhaps erase the open source label above something like Node-RED, for example, then call it, for example, Siemens does it, you used to call it Siemens Flow Creator. And this was pure Node-RED in an outdated version that's running on that. And I think it's just, if you bundle open source, be transparent about what's in your software, which is already a benefit. And then if you put something on top of it, also putting an open source with a good commercialization model on top is also super attractive. Because hopefully, and I'm quite confident on that, this piece will be super important in any factory in the future. So it will be as, if not more important than an MES. So it will be the bridge between anything on the shop floor and in the application way. And owning the data is super important. So step one, that the data is not with any vendor in any cloud so that you can control it. But beyond that, I'm also quite confident it's important to govern the software. So who owns the software? If the prices are increased, if the service levels change, if the software, like certain features are discontinued, how do I do that? And open source is a super attractive answer to the governance problem on this crucial component in your factory. Yeah.
I think definitely there's a couple of recent examples where I'm just thinking about VMware, for example, where they just like massively increased prices, kicked customers almost out. I mean, what was it, times 4 or 5 more? And you have no way out except migrating.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a nuclear option that you now have. So like it is migrating out of it, or you can also just fork the open source part. Yeah, still there's a toll to that attached, so you need to maintain it on your own. But you always have this as an option. So I
Well,
think it's nice to have that.
but what I think, picking up on the question that David said before, how would I'm seeing that you would probably benefit from having more IT savvy people in your OT organization to be able to really yeah have the most benefit from those kind of environments, because it needs a different way of thinking maybe
Yeah.
that we're not so used to see in OT environments. On the other hand, I also get it, like if at midnight something happens and production is going to shut down, I mean, who am I going to call to help me out? You need help at some time.
Yeah.
So how would you see the OT organization of the future evolve, let's say, to make most use of open source?
Well, I think there is this. So if we just look at our customers, I think this is always a good example. That there's this, I would say, traditional OT organization who still lives in the TIA portal software stack way of thinking. This are the people that you definitely need to get data out there, to contextualize and get the machines up and running. But there's, I would say, this hybrid form of a human being now evolving as somebody who is actually, I think he needs to have an engineering background point. It's way
Yeah.
easier to have somebody
Yeah.
from OT teach IT versus the other way around. For
Yeah.
IT people, OT is just stupid what they're doing there. This is just stupid, just point, and they don't want to learn. We just did the experience. No finger pointing, but OT people who are in their free time, for example, are super into home automation, having their Docker containers spin up. And I think this is the hybrid that we are seeking. So people coming from a traditional educational OT way, but are still open and also interested in IT best practices. So they don't need to be engineering DevOps experts, but they need to be able to get the fundamentals right. And I think this is essential for building a successful organization.
I think it goes even a bit further than that, because I think, David, you had an interview once with Davey, who is trying to bring in those DevOps practices, but also like all the benefits that come with it into the world of programming a PLC. Why shouldn't you use support of an LLM like
Yeah.
all the other developers do
Yeah.
when you're working on your PLC, for example? And you will need people in your organization who are open to experiment with that and want to put the time in to learn those things to really, before you start to get the benefits of it.
Davey called it, and I think it was a very nice way of putting it. Automate the automation engineer. I still use that saying quite a lot, because he really nails it. Like we have this, I would say, job thing or job title we call
Yeah.
an automation engineer, but the automation engineer starts with Word documents and Excel sheets and
Yeah.
copy pasting and yeah.
I really think we need to synchronize the underlying technologies. So in the 70s, automation and IT split up, like everybody knows. Somebody took the left turn to ladder logic, somebody took the right turn to object-oriented programming more, and then now we're like really, really far apart. And this now led to IT things, software gets deployed via container applications, and OT is still using PDF to then go step by step to install something on Windows. And I think, and still lives in Excel. And what I would love to see, and where the future is also now heading, is to have under the hood IT best practices. So use, for example, Postgres for data storage, not something proprietary. Use something like MQTT or Kafka for data transmission and distribution, not something proprietary. We're also not the hugest fans of OPC UA, but go to the IT way, but now make it applicable. So make it usable for the people who have not extensive experience to then use LLMs for programming, use Git for versioning, so that you get for
absolutely.
free the commodities of IT now. Yeah.
I've seen a couple of your posts on, well, or at least the company's posts on
Yeah.
on OPC. But let's not go into the
Yeah.
OPC versus MQTT
Yeah.
discussion in this one.
But open standards, yeah. So open standards and
Yeah,
open source, and yeah.
open standards, lightweights where possible, I would say. Willem asked you for, I would say, the future OT organization or that type of thing. You already stated a couple of words. I would like to turn the question around to future OT data stack. So you already mentioned, yeah, MQTT. You mentioned the way to store. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that? So what would be the future, in your opinion, OT stack? Maybe also linking that to the unified namespace
Yeah.
discussion.
So something that you touched based already quite a lot on. So let me try to give my 2 cents. So something to connect. So don't be any vendor, but something that still, because old protocols are still here for 10 to 15 years to come. So we're not standardized yet. So there needs to be something to convert protocols. There needs to be something for the data ops part. So like the industrial data management, how you want to call it, to create data models from those data that's coming in. Then there needs to be a message broker. And there, I think, or we have a little bit of a different, it's not, in our opinion, not only MQTT, because in manufacturing, it's all about a lot of transactions. So getting work orders, setting something up. Therefore, something like Kafka actually is quite powerful. So perhaps a combination of MQTT for all the Wi-Fi devices, all the AGVs who are disconnected, where MQTT makes a lot of sense, and for all the transactions and data cannot be lost situations, Kafka. A time series database, not a historian anymore, could be, in our opinion, timescale is really good. There are other options like QuestDB or Influx. And then perhaps some people called it an IoT platform. At the end, I think Grafana is actually the most used tool out there to actually visualize data. So something around those realms, I think, will be in every factory in the next 10 years. Yeah.
You touched the topics of standards there. Now we have a couple of standards, but if you could have one thing that would be standardized, what would it be in that stack?
What are we missing?
Standardizing. So the foundation answer to that, to standardize the assets. So standardize a frying pan, for example, to its core 3 attributes would be the answer of associations.
I've actually, and this is not a joke. I've seen the standard of a frying pan. Yes, it actually exists, Willem.
I'm pretty sure there's somewhere in Germany a guy.
Yeah. In Germany, we actually have like huge government money spent on that, but another topic. So
Yeah.
if I would love to have something standardized, in my opinion, it should be actually the API to something like that. So how do you access data? So like, I'm not sure, like people are now prepping for LLMs with MCP. I don't know. It's just a JSON interface. What's so special about it in my IT way of thinking? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But I think this is something that we should agree on. how do you now connect to applications, machines, and sensors on an interface level? And this is not OPC-UA in our opinion. It's not MQTT. Um, in a nice way of thinking, it would be a good structured and documented REST interface. But yeah, this is something that we should, in my opinion, agree on for events and transactions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the past it was often seen as a way to monetize the data
Yeah.
of your device, where you would say, yes, but you need, I mean, we've seen things, David, like serial ports where they switched pins and you had to buy their special cable where they're like twisted a pair. But that cable, of course, cost 500 euros because it's very special.
Yeah, this is cool. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Fun fact, we've been with like large management consulting before we've started UMH. And then there was this wave of, we are now machine builders, machines, we get like huge pressure out of Asia now. How do we set ourselves apart? Digital operating models, software, etc., pp. And the answer to a lot of vendors was, okay, let's just monetize the access to our data. And this was like, oh no. And it's still like that. And one of our community members, the best trick is if you're a CNC machine user, you activate the keylogger, call a service mechanic, then you get logged a password to the OpenCA server, and you have now free access.
yeah, yeah. But I think they're missing the boat there in trying to paywall the access to the data.
Yeah, but there's also there's regulation now should remove that, the EU Data Act. Let's see, but yeah.
But still, I would say there are still lots of steps to take. Yeah, it's again, it's about organization. You touched, I would say, the knowledge we also have to have on the OT side. We touched the future OT IT data stack, and then the way we'll be accessing data, the way we get to those machines. That's definitely the next step. I would say that's been a very interesting conversation, Alexander. I think if we would do this again in a year or so, maybe even not that long, but I think many things will probably have changed, because they are changing quite
Very
rapidly.
fast.
Yeah, it's good. Finally, yeah.
So thank you for joining us. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you want to know more about our work, obviously there is our website, itotinsider.com, but now also our newly launched ITOT Academy, which you can find on itot.academy. The domain actually exists,
Nice.
so why not itot.academy? Alexander, thank you very much. Good luck with promoting open standards of open systems and Unite Manufacturing up. And until we meet again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you both. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.